Right, so hi everyone, and welcome to episode 7 of Mind the Gap, Veran's podcast series where we talk to business and thought leaders about the gaps they're now facing as HR, business, CIO leaders following the pandemic and what they are seeing as being most important to solve and what problems actually need to be solved, and then what tips and techniques there are to solve those problems. I'm Tom Holmes, founding director of Veran Performance, which is a technology agnostic consultancy that helps businesses to solve their HR, finance and technology problems to bring about digital transformation, particularly in the back office. So all the functions you don't see is what we work with digitally transforming. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Gianni Giacomeli, who is the head of innovation, design and research at MIT and ex-CIO of Genpact, which as we all know is one of the largest businesses. So welcome, good morning Gianni.
Good morning to you, how are you?
Very well, very well. So what do you do at MIT? Can you give us a quick brief of what your role is, Gianni?
So we're trying to build prototypes that help networks of people be augmented by digital technologies to be expressed, to help them express higher intelligence. So in many respects, what we're trying to do is what we call building a supermind, which is really thinking about how the brain works. The brain has network capabilities, and that is what creates emerging intelligence. We try to do that with networks of people. And the Center for Collective Intelligence, I'm head of innovation. We have a design lab where we try to build prototypes to do that.
And it's really interesting because driving networks, all of our business lives, we're a consultancy, your work in education and other areas, it's all been about networks. My whole career in technology has been about networks. Do you think things have got harder or easier over the COVID period? Because it was different, right, 2 or 3 years ago in terms of driving networks, or wasn't it? What's your view? Is there a seismic change, or are things kind of the same?
Oh, totally. I mean, certainly a lot of change has happened, both good and bad. So the good part is that the world discovered that we can function like this. And so this is the equivalent, if you think about it, Tom, of the brain discovering that you can make longer axons.
Yeah.
Right? You make longer axons, they still function, you still can connect parts of the brain, and you can actually make a bigger brain, and that's a big deal. And I think that's the reason why the pandemic has been good, because, hey, you're in London, I'm in Berlin, you could be in New Zealand, and I could be in Nova Scotia, and nothing would change. So that is good. What is less good is that most of us never had this before, and I think all of us are kind of dealing with our online networks a little bit of seat of pants kind of thing, meaning that we didn't go to school. So I certainly didn't, go to school learning about how to use an online network and make it function. And seat of pants are not good. I mean, a bunch of our instincts are not good enough in this new environment. So that's the bad thing. I mean, the reality is we've all been in offices. Offices are communication technologies, right? They're built in a way to make people bumping to each other, and we don't have an equivalent, online network architect in the online world, and that is a problem.
Yes, that's true. Because if I think about most of the in the collaborative industries, which is where I've been working for the last 30 years, then architecturally those buildings have transformed over that 30-year period. Where I can think back to the original one. We had everyone had offices and separate little offices, maybe 1 or 2 people per office, that kind of thing. Everyone was smoking, right, and all stuff like that, but then we saw transformation in the open plan, driving, and then more latterly, collaborative areas where people were actually, you'd have your desks, but that took up less space of the office throughout our careers, and then there was more and more collaborative space. And that whole architecture was designed to allow this form of collaboration, etc. So now we've got to do that electronically. Do you think that's a permanent thing is one question, but also how do we start to address this to replace this stuff? So I suppose I'll break that down. The first question is, do you think it's a permanent change to this kind of online collaboration, or do you think we're going to all be back to where we were in a few years' time?
It is a permanent change, and we haven't seen anything yet.
Okay, so then how do we best address it? So let's talk about that. How do we create, replicate, or even improve those environments now we're in this permanently new world?
I guess we'll talk about some of that today, but frankly, the first thing to do is to realize that as leaders, as managers, we need to pay attention to that, and we need to learn how to do that, and we need to get our people to learn how to do that. Right? I mean, the larger your organization, the higher the chances are that there's going to be variance. There's going to be people who do this naturally, and there's going to be people who do this very poorly. And when they do this very poorly, you will see a couple of things. First, you'll see attrition. People who are disengaged, sometimes they're disengaged because they cannot relate to others anymore, and this kind of new situation increases the chances. So you're going to see variance in quality of management, which leads to disengagement and then attrition, but also you'll see impact on culture, cohesiveness, and ultimately innovation. So the first thing is to realize that we have a bit of Houston, we have a problem kind of situation, as opposed to, we've done a few calls here and there, and that's all there is.
Right, so yes, because then when I think back to our previous conversation about the architecture, it was the architects and people like that who were thinking through how to deliver those collaborative environments physically, etc. So, we'd say, I need some areas, breakout areas and stuff like that. And then if I was lucky, the architects would come out with something innovative and brilliant which would allow that to work. But you're saying your top tip, I think your first top tip is that we as leaders need to directly address how to create collaborative environments in our businesses.
So I think this concept of digital watercooler that emerges. I've been working for many years now, again, trying to build superminds, and my work is really designing superminds. So there's a website, supermind.design, if people are interested. But the idea really is to be proactive and deliberate about intervening in the formation of those networks, in the nurturing of those networks. And one of the simplest things that people could do right now is the creation of digital water coolers, which, like the word says, are serendipitous encounters that are facilitated by digital technologies. And we talk about how that is, but the reality is that what we've seen from data, Microsoft has done a lot of work around that in the last 2 years, many other sources. We see that three situations are happening. One is, and some of them are worse better than others. So first of all, the strong ties. So you have a team and you work with them all the time. That hasn't really suffered that much. In what has suffered is what is called weak ties, and part of weak ties, which is a little bit of a Venn diagram, is not completely the same, but the weak ties and cross-sectional ties. So weak ties are people you bump into periodically, but not that often, and serendipitously. That doesn't happen anymore. That actually is shrinking. And the cross-enterprise ties, which very often are not people you need to work with, say you work in marketing, you bump into people in engineering periodically once in a while, and now in this new environment, you actually do a lot less of that.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of data that shows that happens, and that, we'll probably discuss, has implications. I think that's something that we need to hit to.
Yeah, I mean, it is very interesting. If I think about that from my experience, the accidental and then the kind of connections which would otherwise not have been made. So, water cooler is one example, but basically by hanging around the office, I would meet anyone from CEO and then, down to the first graduate who's just arrived. And with each of them, I'd be making a connection, even, a weak one or a strong one or whatever, but a real connection. So that then later on, if it came up in conversation, it would be, I might be talking to the CEO about something, but I remember that the graduate down there is also looking at that area, and that there's that thing going on which that guy, I don't even know who it is, told me about the other day. And that has gone. You're absolutely right. So these weak ties are I used to find them both important, but also, Gianni, rewarding. It was a rewarding part of work, having those weaker and more accidental conversations. It made it fun, right? Because, to be honest, much of my work is fairly tedious, as I'm sure yours is too. And it was nice talking to a graduate who just joined about whatever it was. So what are your thoughts about how, what is the technology world suggesting how we might, or some of the things we might be thinking about to regenerate those weaker ties?
Yeah, I think we are in luck in that there's quite a few strands of both technology and methods that have come together in the last 3-4 years that allow us to create intentional serendipity supported by what I call augmented by digital technologies. And one of the things that I've worked on in the last few years, obviously a lot of network analysis and a lot of understanding of these problems and the fact that if you work on them, they get better. But also, I'll just give you a very specific example. If some of your audience uses Microsoft, and Microsoft has called something that is now called Viva Insights. It's really basic in network analysis. What my team and I did, we basically created a virtual assistant, literally a bot, that looks at everybody's calendar. Now we're talking about, in this case, 50-odd thousand people. Looked at everybody's calendars, finds slots between two people who seem to have a bit of time at the same time. Just 15 minutes. Literally, it's an encounter, it's not a meeting. And the most important thing, because there's quite a few tools that do that in a randomized way and almost like a blind date kind of thing, I don't think that it works. What works instead is to overlay on top of that bot that looks at the calendar the network analysis part of it. Meaning, Tom will have probably 10 to 20 strong ties and probably 50 to 150 or even more weak ties.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that Tom's calendar is proactively matched with that 50 or 100 or 150 people and not with the 10. Right? Mm-hmm. And so you overlay the two and you create an algorithm. Obviously, the strong weak ties thing can also be improved by machine learning over time, but literally you can use Microsoft Viva Insights and then there's an algorithm that pretty much eliminates all the strong ties from the algorithm, and then it's the matching thing. So you can do that. Is not rocket science. I mean, it's a lot of work and it's a lot of finessing, but the tools exist to do that at scale. And then when it happens, it scales. You literally we switched it on, I think September last year. It just goes. And there's thousands of people who have this and literally have replicated a watercooler experience. Now, the big part of it, the good part of it is the more it goes, the more these interactions leave breadcrumbs that then you can go and mine through machine learning. So you see which people ended up meeting each other, which people liked meeting each other. So there's a whole lot of transparency you can get to figure out drivers of engagement, for example. So
there's kind of a feedback mechanism in these tools where you can go, that was a good conversation, or it was an interesting conversation, I liked them, I didn't like them, or whatever it is. Do you set any agenda for those conversations? Is there a need to tell people the kind of thing which they should be talking about, or is that something which is better found by the individuals themselves?
So during the design phase, we actually had quite a lot of discussion about it, and we ended up giving people the ability to access a bit of an icebreaker kind of thing. I mean, like 10 to 15 things you can talk to the next person about. from how's the weather to, what did you eat yesterday night, and, what's your favorite drink. So remember, these people kind of know each other a little bit, right? They're not, unknown to each other. And what we found is it doesn't take much. It's like a water cooler. Yeah, some people will find it awkward, but most people will, they'll just go with the flow. And so we didn't really force fit much of an agenda to that thing. Also, because we didn't want to make it feel like a meeting.
Yes.
It needs to feel like an encounter. Otherwise, people say, what the hell, I have enough meetings in my calendar.
Yeah, I mean, one of the key things that I always found in those kind of networking meetings is kind of working out how we're connected. So it's kind of like, oh, are you in that person's team? Do you work with that person? Do you know this guy? That kind of a thing then is a kind of classic second tier water cooler activity. The first one, which is the kind of hello, what do you do and stuff like that, and the icebreaker. But then it's like, how are we already connected? Are we already connected? And that's and you learn so much more about other areas of the business by following those kind of, because these aren't real networks. These aren't who do you report to and who do I report to and do they know each other. These are kind of an organisation's neural networks, the way people feel they're connected within business, not the reporting lines, etc. I think generally, and I think that's very interesting. Do you suggest that these things are best one-to-ones, or have you tried a group approach on this? Because you could, the old water cooler, there was often 2 or 3 people there. Gianni, how does that analysis work?
It's a fantastic point. Actually, we designed quite a lot around it. I think in general, multiple people could be a good addition to this, especially if you think about knowledge exchange. So the bigger the group, the more diverse. What we found, though, is that we wanted to stay with the one-to-one for a very simple reason, which is a bit of a, you're familiar with, tragedy of the commons. If there's 3 people who are being invited, each of them could actually feel, I can bail out at the last minute because, the other ones will show up.
Yeah. Whereas
if it is just 2 of you, you will actually pay attention because, you don't want to, just let the other person show up and you haven't. So it's a bit of a game theory kind of thing. And so for the moment, we've actually done it with one-to-ones.
And you mentioned earlier that some people are better at this and some people are worse at this. Some people are keener and some people are less keen. So I can well imagine the digital hider, the person who, cancels every single one of these 15-minute things and, and basically doesn't participate and get the benefit of the way you describe it. And actually, presumably, Gianni, those are the people you want to reach most. So yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, I was going to open it to you as to whether...
I think it's bang on. It is bang on, and look, I think my bet, and maybe because I work at MIT and we look at the future, etc., is in 10, 15 years, we will look at these times and we'll say dark ages, right? And we're basically seeing it's color blindness. If you ask the CEO will never think about this way. I mean, what I'm advocating is that CEOs and CXOs look at companies as brains. We literally have network connections, you feed them, you nurture them, intelligence emerges. That's it. That's the game. And so you want to nurture this thing, and you want to find out if there are some parts of the network that are not firing together with other parts of the network. And so this is one of the situations where you're saying, hey, a bunch of people will cancel these meetings. If these people are really central to the networks, you really want to coach these people. Because you're doing lobotomy to your collective brain right there. I'll give you another example. I think it's interesting. Onboarding, right? I mean, you certainly work a lot on, this kind of practice. One of the biggest issues with remote work is newly onboarded people suffer most from not having those weak ties being connected and structured, and the culture, percolating, etc. And you really want to pay attention to those people. And interestingly, these people, when they come in, they don't have a network. They're not imprinted in the network, they're not part of the network. So you need to create that network so that they can route and then expand their field of vision.
Right.
So you need to do that.
And that also has a practical. There's an even more harder-edged part of that as well for our support teams and all that stuff, which is that a lot of those conversations amongst new joiners, etc., about how do you do this, how do you do that, can I come in half an hour early or can I stay half an hour late? What happens then? How do I do my expense claim? All that kind of stuff, which no doubt is written down somewhere, but people actually learn about that from their peers and from these minor conversations, not from, hopefully not from phoning their manager or having a discussion about this, or worst case, being too scared to ask those questions and then it just sitting there, and then you've got someone who's kind of been working there 2 years, working in an organisation 2 years, and goes, God, I never realised I could open that door and walk into that other room. It's got, I always thought that was not allowed. And that is a waste. So, but you've touched on something really interesting there, Gianni, which is you seem to be suggesting that the function of CEOs, their measure of success, is creating intelligence in an organisation. Presumably, with a view that then generates the other things the business needs to do. Is that
totally? I mean, I think my impression is that 10 years from now, this is going to be a lot more prevalent. CEOs will look at fundamentally the 4 things that make that supermind fire. You need to make sure that the connectivity happens, so you know where the nodes are and you will help them connect, like the water cooler example. You give the network, not the individual people, network guidance in terms of incentives. Kind of things that you said before. This is why it's tolerated here. This is how things are rewarded here. This is something that is not rewarded, right? Culture is part of that. So that's incentives. You need to feed these networks with external information. All of us are painfully aware of what happens with insularity and flat earthers and that kind of stuff. We start, and networks actually have that problem. They tend to become a little insular. So the job of the CEO is also make sure that the sun shines through, kind of thing. And the 4th aspect is enabling collaboration environments that enable people to connect to each other meaningfully, asynchronously as well as synchronously, right? So asynchronous work. So when you do those 4 things, and I think those should be a CEO's job, and obviously the CIO will help, and a bunch of other people will help. But if it doesn't come from the very top, I don't think that the individual managers, middle management, will be able to, because this is systemic network dynamics, and the only people who can actually act on that from a design and incentives and investment is the people at the top.
Right, and because you want your brain to be functioning in every dimension and properly, it's no good having one super effective area, and we've seen this in companies where they have their innovative, the center of innovation, and that's supposed to be kind of the brain, and then the rest of the business, they're kind of like, I don't know, operations, something like that, where they're kind of thickies who are supposed to take what the brain says and then do it. But actually, having a brain which fully functions seems to me to be the argument you're describing.
I think you're spot on, and not today, but there's a lot of parallels with neuroscience and actually biology. I mean, what you talked about is exactly right. I mean, we very often mistook organizational design for when you think about creating centers of excellence. It's like saying, we're going to design a neocortex, there's a prefrontal neocortex that is somewhat connected to the rest of the brain and the body, but not really. Mm-hmm. That nature doesn't do it that way, and I think many companies end up doing it that way, and so it's a big mistake right there. So what you said is exactly right.
Yeah, it is interesting. So we've talked about the use of Viva Insights for this kind of thing, but I get the feeling if I took MIT and where you work at the moment is a good example. That for decades has been functioning, I imagine, in a very broad and disparate manner, and yet creating the kind of value you're talking about. Because, I don't know where I read, but I think I read somewhere that like about half of the value in all technologies in the world came from people who are MIT related, etc. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, and I'm sure it's very hard to do that kind of stat, but it's certainly a super brain which has been generating that stuff. So what's it been like working in the research and academic world during the COVID crisis, and how is MIT, how are you adapting your work at MIT for this new world, Gianni?
That's a great point. I'll tell you about MIT, but any organization that produces knowledge at that level will have that. I mean, consulting firms are a little bit of that too. I cannot talk about MIT in general because what I work on is quite specific. We are part of MIT Sloan School of Management, and
yes.
So we kind of connected that way. My team is completely virtual since 2-3 years ago. I used to go up. I used to live in New York. I used to go up once a month. And so for us, it's been quite natural because most of our ties within MIT end up being somewhat strong ties. I remember cafeteria conversations, just bumping into people from other departments, bumping into students, bumping into visitors, etc. That thing has completely gone away. So all that weak tie stuff that I do think that MIT people rely on, it's kind of, now they're back, but it's a dangerous thing. In my case, it doesn't really matter all that much because I work only part of my time at MIT, and my network is a lot outside of MIT. Mm-hmm. But for people who work at MIT most of the time, then the danger is very clear right there, right? So that you can actually make yourself insular, and siloing something like MIT is really not what you would want to do. So that's by the way, that's one of the reasons why the communal spaces are built for that, right? So there's quite a few buildings that historically, I don't know about that 50% thing, but historically, some of the big innovations that you see out there from a technology perspective came from the design of the corridors and office layouts and and that you need to replicate.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely, and I can see that the digital, you've given us real practical insights in how to create the digital water cooler. I mean, I don't even need Viva. I'm in a small firm. I don't even need Viva Insights to schedule my quarter and hours. I can do that quite easily amongst our team of about 100 people or whatever, and put that in place quite quickly. And I think I probably will. But so I can see that's highly practical. What other steps beyond that are? So we've replicated the water cooler. What about the corridor? What about the conference room and the cafeteria and stuff like that? How do we deal with? Are there other things we should be thinking about, Gianni, to replace those things?
And look, I think I could also ask you the question, and you have most probably a lot of perspectives that are probably even better than mine. But what is happening right now is this concept of future of work, our office space, and how often do we want our people to go back to the office, right? And there's a notion out there that's circulating that organic hybrid work isn't really functional because the day you go to the office. The day I go to the office, maybe they're not the same days, and you and I should connect. And yes. Since it's organic, you decide that you go on Monday and I do Tuesday because I drop off my daughters to school and whatever. And there needs to be serendipity, but there needs to be intentionality. And it kind of sounds like a contradiction in terms, but it shouldn't be. So I would actually start with network analysis. What are the people who should connect? And those people who should connect, or presumably connected before the pandemic hit, should come to the office on the same days.
Yes.
And be in the same spaces and have spaces that are conducive to them spending a little bit of time together. So that's probably the first thing I would do. Just look at the network maps from back then, or intuitively, to your point, maybe right? That department with this department, they should actually have some collegiality. I would start with that. Just time, right? Time for synchronous meetings and making sure that people are in the same place.
It is interesting because if I took a full range, we do have organisations we talk to which are basically turning the clock back. It's so fundamental to them to network, etc., that they're saying everybody has to be in on the same basis as it was pre-COVID, and there is not a choice because our team cannot work. There are a second group who are doing the kind of days for certain groups and stuff like that, as you described there. But that's a challenging thing because, even on, which day do you pick, Gianni? And as you say, it's convenient for this guy, not for this lady, not for that, but, and all that stuff. And then, of course, you've got the people who simply, even when the day is picked and all that stuff, then consider it to be a bit optional to go at all. And so it hasn't been 100% effective. So we're seeing a range of approaches in that area. But the underlying fact, which is there is no replication yet for that kind of group networking, it's almost the even weaker ties than the water cooler. Because actually, whichever way you look at it, the water cooler conversation is actually quite intimate. The 15-minute conversations you're talking about is actually intimate as well, particularly when they're one-to-one. That more broader of even looser than that, I think that we have I don't think there are many answers. I think about it particularly where it impacts me is in conferences and things like that. So we used to use conferences where there'd be a series of stages and then people interested in that topic broadly would go to that area, and you might have 50 people there, 60 people, but then through the questions and answers and the discussion you'd find these cross-organisational links. You'd find, and it would be, that's very interesting that you said that, I'd like to link with you. Very weak ties, which sometimes became stronger, critically important for many people's working. And I'm not really seeing, it's been a big failure, really, trying to make those online, in my experience. But have you had any better experiences of that, of replicating that kind of thing?
No. Actually, the short answer, by the way, your point is very well documented in science, for example. Pretty much the dynamics that you're talking about. You meet somebody at the conference, the conference is an aggregation factor, kind of topics that are relevant to everybody, and then you hit off or not, and then you build stuff. So there's actually science that shows exactly what you're saying. The solution has been a little bit of half-baked kind of thing. I do think that we are also in a time in which our use of social media is a little naive. And if you think about the concept of actually technology that is developing now, knowledge graphs. Knowledge graphs basically are what powers Google, right? Google looks at content and looks at people behind content, people and organizations. And that allows Google to actually figure out what is connected with what, right? Which is actually one of the reasons why they can do what they do. We cannot do the same as an individual human. I mean, what I'd love to do is, hey, I work on collective intelligence. Who are the 500 people in the world that I should be connecting with so I can follow them, I can see what they are writing, what they are reading, what they are talking about, and then I reach out to them. You can't do that. Right? So you have no equivalent of knowledge graph, you have no equivalent of a digital water cooler with people outside of your organization. And I do think that's a massive opportunity that the world is missing in kind of rewiring the collective brain. But to your point, the conferences used to do some of that. Now I think they've been handicapped by pretty much the new culture.
I mean, I remember when we first got LinkedIn, and I was invited to the 200 Club, which was a party which was very few people people with more than 200 connections, which sounds ridiculous now when everyone's got thousands and thousands, but that's the way it was. And that's what we thought was going to happen. I was just amazed. I thought, I can link to everybody who is in that particular segment and talk to them all, and that's so exciting. But it didn't work, and it's very loose now. I mean, now I'm connected to probably 4,000 recruiters, and then 1,000 or two really close people. But it's very hard. Our brains are not sorted for being able to sift through that and make sense of it, I think, Gianni. And, as you pointed out, all the technology firms are very interested in creating intimacy and one-to-one type relationships and intimacy with the technology. They're not focused on weaker stuff.
Yeah, the problem is that we sell advertising online, and what LinkedIn does sells the ability to hire people. Those are the two sources of monetization. What we just talked about has value, but is not monetized very, back to the point about the CEO. Would CEOs pay money for that today? They should, but I think if you go and try and sell some of that to many CEOs, they'll say, oh, but it sounds a little soft. I think it's a massive missed opportunity, Tom.
Yes, I do too, actually. I think it's, I learn more from those people. I learn as much from those people outside of my business as I do, which is why I do these kind of calls. But I'm privileged in being able to marshal this conversation and talk to you and other thinkers like yourself about these areas. And I get to answer my questions. We have weak but strong ties now, Gianni, which I love. But I know that's harder for everyone else to replicate. I think it is, it's fascinating talking to you about all of these topics, and I've really learnt some key things here, Gianni. Most important to me is your clearly strong view that CEOs should be driving these kind of networks in their business, and then allow other results to come after.
I'm sorry, can you elaborate the question a little bit more? Maybe I lost it.
It's not really a question at all. It's just an observation about how smart you are.
Thank you. That's probably the reason it didn't resonate with me.
Now, we've got another question, which is, how does this approach apply in smaller companies where people generally have strong connections within the company but are not participating in meeting a wider network around the work? For example, people that you used to meet but now have online sessions such as this. So I guess they're talking about small and intimate organisations. So how do we replicate what is lost there, Gianni?
I think for smaller organizations, there's less of a problem, as long as they manage to have downtime in intimate conversations, right? So even with your strong ties, there's a weak part of it, which is when you really talk about the things that really are on your heart and you cannot talk about. I would say, though, the smaller the organization, maybe the smaller the network, but the external network may be very significant. And so the risk for smaller organizations is actually to atrophy the weak ties with the external world. And I think the smaller you are, the more you want to have a strong ability to work in an ecosystem. And so those weak ties, back to your point, I think it's exactly right on conferences. How do you make sure that proactively you fill that gap? Because that gap is certainly there. So that's what I would say for smaller organizations. So just make sure you have downtime so you talk about the hard side of the story, and make sure that your external ecosystem doesn't atrophy.
Great. Well, Gianni, we're nearly out of time there, so it's been fascinating talking to you. Thank you very much. What my key takeaways are that, and what I've really learned today, is it's the leader's role to focus on driving networks within a business. That's my first. The second is that the weak ties are as important as the strong ties in a different way, and that's fascinating to me. I think that it's our duty, you're telling me, and which I believe, to try and create a super brain within our organisation. I'm going to go for brain within our organisation, and then I'll move on to super or better as we go forward. And fourthly, and sadly, that you think there's a lot of work to be done on the broader network without of our organisations. And I kind of think that's true. I think we should talk again in months to come to address that question, because I think that, you know, this is going to be very difficult for businesses, because we all interact in a broader network than our own organisation itself.
You're 100%, and thanks for the conversation.
Brilliant, Gianni. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of the day, and I'd like to thank all of our audience for joining us today on what was, I think, one of our most fascinating talks this year. So thank you very much. We'll be doing this again in a couple of weeks' time, and Gianni, thank you very much for your time as well. Have a great day, everyone.